When Chu Lian heard Minjian's voice out of the blue, her eyes widened in shock. It took her a while to react, and when she did, she quickly grabbed a dry cloth hanging on the screen nearby to cover her chest. Immediately after, she could hear the sound of He Changdi's heavy footsteps coming closer and closer. In the midst of his rage, He Sanlang simply charged right in. The bathroom was filled with dense steam, and a nice fragrance lingered in the air. Water splashed out of the bathtub as the girl inside hid in a corner of the tub, panicking as she clutched a wet cotton cloth to her chest that barely protected her modesty. However, Chu Lian didn't realize that this cotton cloth, meant for drying off after a bath, was very thin. Once it got wet, it was practically translucent. By placing the nearly transparent cloth over her chest, it was 100 times more enticing than if she hadn't used it at all. Although she was submerged in the water, due to her intense panic, her chest was heaving from her heavy breathing. The shapes of rounded peaks and small pink dots bobbed up and down underneath the wet cloth cover, playing a game of hide and seek. This unintentionally captivating sight shocked He Changdi so much that, upon seeing her, he was rooted to the spot. All of his reckless fury had been completely drained out of him. Minjian stomped her foot and, with a troubled expression on her face, was about to chase after him, but she was held back by senior servant Gi. "What are you doing?" "It's young master who went in, not some stranger," senior servant Gi warned her in a low volume. Minjian tried to speak up, but what? "Quick, come out with me." He Sanlang's fair face was covered all the way up to his hairline in a deep blush, just like a cooked lobster. The heat that he had been feeling had come back at some point, and a certain part of his lower body was currently standing at attention. Chu Lian was angry. He was the one who wasn't willing to consummate their marriage, and he had even gone out of his way to humiliate her on their wedding night. However, now he was the one who was staring at her stupidly while she was taking a bath. What was this guy trying to do? At this point, she honestly couldn't care less. Chu Lian simply picked up a bar of soap and threw it at him. Her lovely voice raised in anger as she shouted, "You, get out!" After regaining his senses thanks to Chu Lian's delicate shout, He Sanlang's body stiffened as he noticed the desire that shouldn't have even existed in his mind. His face immediately turned as black as an inkstick. Grimacing, he glared at Chu Lian and shouted back, "You tried to seduce me with looks like that? Dream on." On that parting note, He Sanlang tossed his sleeves and spun on his foot, striding out with as much dignity as he could muster, albeit a little stiffly. If he had managed to match his icy tone with an equally icy expression, then Chu Lian might have been angered enough to hop right out of the bathtub and pick a fight with him. However, his face had been completely red and his actions extremely unnatural, adding on the bulge sitting at a certain part of his body that should not be described. He just seemed like a haughty cat pretending not to be embarrassed. Thanks to He Sanlang's actions, Chu Lian's anger and tension completely dissipated. Once he left the bathroom, she couldn't hold back anymore and the corners of her lips twitched upwards in soundless laughter. By the time she had finished changing into some clean clothes and had come out of the bathroom, He Changdi was no longer in the room. With a blush on her face, Minjian passed a cup of warm water to Chu Lian before helping Chu Lian brush her slippery wet hair. "Where's my husband?" "Third young master left the courtyard 10 minutes ago. This servant doesn't know where he went." Chu Lian took a sip of her water and shook her head. She really couldn't understand He Sanlang at all. Instead of trying to, she casually picked up a book left on the wooden sofa and started reading. Meanwhile, He Changdi, who had left in such a rush, was now in the outer court's study room. He had downed 2 cups of cold tea in quick succession the minute he returned, but that strange heat in his heart couldn't be suppressed. When he closed his eyes, the scene of Chu Lian sitting in the bathtub appeared in his mind, her hands holding a cloth to her chest as she watched him with widened, teary eyes of shock. "Damn it!" he cursed. How could he feel anything for that wicked woman? All he wanted to do was kill her immediately. In this moment, He Changdi hated himself. He punched the table, shaking a small tray used for washing brushes. The fire in his body refused to go down. In the end, He Sanlang went to take a cold shower with a dark expression. At night, He Changdi and Chu Lian attended a family dinner at the outer court's parlor room. After the dinner, The eldest son of the family requested a meeting with them. From the head of the table, He Changqi gave his brother strict instructions. Sanlang, your wife is going to return to her maiden home tomorrow. Promise me that you'll take care of everything. And don't let our He family lose face. Understand? He Changdi agreed expressionlessly. Chu Lian secretly gave her eldest brother-in-law a thumbs up. He Changqi was just like the novel had described. Although he looked a little rough, he was actually a careful person who treated his sister-in-law with consideration. As the saying, an elder brother is like a father goes. He Changqi was a good brother, without a doubt. He must have seen how they weren't getting along, so he had gotten them to stay back just to give a reminder to He Sanlang. Sister-in-law, my brother was spoiled rotten by my grandmother and mother. Please be more understanding with him. Chu Lian hurriedly gave a greeting and replied, yes, older brother. He Changqi only spoke a few more words to them before letting them go. By this time, the entire Jingan household was already covered in the darkness of night. Only the corridors and pathways were lit up by lanterns. The lantern light was dim, so Chu Lian couldn't see He Changdi's expression clearly. She could only feel that he was in a bad mood, like a caged beast. What had happened to the cheerful and famous He Sanlang of House Jingan from the novel? He had just gotten married. This should have been the happiest time of his life. Why was he acting this way? Chu Lian tossed a few glances at him. She had interacted with many people in her career. Although she didn't understand why this He Sanlang was different from the original character in the book, or why he seemed to hate her, she knew that he wouldn't tell her anything if she asked him right now. The two newlyweds should have been happily in love, but they were more like two cold porcupines, unwilling to get close to each other. Once they returned to their courtyard, He Changdi went straight to the study. Chu Lian couldn't be bothered with him, and simply went to wash up and get ready for bed. It wasn't until late that night that He Sanlang entered the bedroom. When he pushed aside the drapes of the bedchamber, he saw a rosy-cheeked Chu Lian sleeping in the center of the bed. A soundless sneer appeared on his lips. This was probably what had happened in his previous life. This wicked woman slept like a baby when he wasn't around. After this, she would probably turn around and run into another man's arms. Ha! How shameless! Tomorrow, at the Ying household, he was going to expose this wicked woman's true face to everyone. Didn't she like Hao Wujing? Then he would grant their wish to be together. He Sanlang let the drapes fall. He turned around, hands behind his back, and left to sleep in the study. The next day was the day of Chu Lian's visit to her maiden home. The entire He family sent the newlyweds to the entrance of the estate. Under the watchful gaze of matriarchy, the frosty He Changdi walked over to Chu Lian's side and helped her up the carriage. He then mounted his horse and led a party of their families, private soldiers and servants, together with Chu Lian in the carriage, as they headed towards the Ying estate. By the time they reached the Ying estate's main gate, only an hour had passed. Old Duke Ying was waiting with a huge group of people by the entrance. He Changdi first glanced at the group before purposely letting his expression warm up a little, acting as if he was surprised as he dismounted from his horse. This was what he had done in his previous life. The He family was small. Even when everyone was there, they couldn't even fill a single banquet table. The first time he had accompanied his wife back to her maiden home, there were 20 or 30 Chu family members standing at the entrance to welcome them. Back then, he had an expression of surprise. However, the second time around, He Changdi no longer felt any joy. Instead, what filled him was intense agony and hatred. He Changdi lifted the curtains of the carriage and personally supported Chu Lian off the carriage. Chu Lian's hands were small and soft, but tender enough to feel comfortable to the touch. He Changdi couldn't help but remember how his heart had almost leaped out of his chest the first time he had touched this pair of hands in his previous life. The memory left him feeling stifled. Once Chu Lian's feet had touched the ground, He Changdi immediately took back his calloused hands. Chu Lian turned to look at the people gathered by the entrance. Although she had tried her best to reassure herself last night before she had fallen asleep, upon seeing this huge group of people from the Ying household in person, her heart still fluttered with anxiety. She didn't recognize a single one of them. Chu Lian inwardly wailed in anguish. She could only guess at some of their identities from the descriptions she had read. She lowered her head, feeling a little guilty. In the eyes of the people from House Ying, she seemed like a shy, blushing bride. Old Duke Ying came up to welcome them in himself. Although He Changdi wasn't happy with the Chu family, old Duke Ying still carried some power in court, so he couldn't dispense with courtesies in public. The newlyweds were led to Juxian Hall in the outer court by the whole group. Old Duke Ying had a generous, kind and friendly personality. He was actually rather caring towards the younger generation as well. It was just that there were too many children in the Ying household, so he couldn't care for all of them. Chu Lian was the legitimate daughter of the second branch of the family, born from the deceased wife of the second master. However, her father had taken another wife, second madam, half a year after her mother had passed away. Thus, even though Chu Lian was a legitimate daughter, she wasn't looked upon too well by the second branch. Even her own father didn't care about her, let alone this grandfather of hers, the old duke who had a pile of matters to handle every day. It was the family of the eldest son who was managing the estate right now. If not for the lackluster younger generation, the old duke would have retired by now since he was over 70 years of age. However, he was still working hard in court for the sake of House Ying. It was enough to make people shake their heads in pity. The younger generation of House Jinggan stood out amongst the young men in the capital. When old Duke Ying saw He Sanlang, he immediately took a liking to him, and even Chu Lian got a few glances from him as a result. Since Chu Lian had been born, and until she had left the household as a bride, she had probably only met old Duke Ying a handful of times. Her cousins from the first branch of the family, the ones who were currently managing the estate, could see that their grandfather had taken a shine to He Sanlang, so they treated Chu Lian a little better. Chu Lian simply stood in the middle of all the older ladies of the Ying estate, her head lowered and her body stiff, answering their questions from time to time. Luckily, Xian was there by her side to give her hints, or Chu Lian would probably have been exposed on the spot. Her eldest sister-in-law from the first branch, Madame Rong, noticed that Chu Lian seemed a little awkward in the midst of all the ladies. Thus, Madame Rong smiled and walked into the circle to help Chu Lian out. Sixth sister, you've only just gotten married and you're already looking so radiant. There are too many people in the outer court right now, so how about us ladies go to the inner court to talk? Your brother Rong just brought back some new tea leaves from Yubei a few days ago, so we can all have some tea while we chat. Madame Rong helped Chu Lian out of the crowd, and in a short moment, a large group of young ladies, both married and unmarried, followed behind them. The previous Chu Lian actually hadn't been too familiar with her older cousins from the main branch, let alone the current Chu Lian. Tightly gripping her sleeves, Chu Lian tried to encourage herself, going by the universal rules of this era. Since she had married into the house of Count Jinggan, she was now considered a member of their household. Her actions no longer represented House Ying, and were instead seen as the actions of House Jinggan. Thus, even though she was now back at the Ying estate, and mingling with the people of the Ying household, she was here as a distinguished guest, rather than a lady of their house. Although House Ying was long past its glory days, it was still a noble house. Furthermore, old Duke Ying seemed to have taken a liking to He Sanlang. No matter how jealous or unhappy these ladies might be, they wouldn't dare make trouble for her here and offend House Jinggan. Anyway, in the original novel, these ladies hadn't made any trouble for Chu Lian. When she had returned to her maiden home, there had only been 2 unhappy incidents and a meeting with a certain person, while everything else had gone smoothly. After thinking it through, Chu Lian's mind settled down, and her body relaxed as well. The crowd of ladies entered the inner court of the Ying estate in a cacophony of noise. Tea and sweets had already been prepared in a pavilion next to a flower garden. Sixth sister, you must have gotten used to the sweets of the Jinggan estate. Surely the sweets of our estate can't be compared to those. The speaker was covering her mouth with a fan, but it wasn't enough to hide her sharp tone. It was the legitimate daughter of the main branch, the 5th miss of the Ying household, Miss Su. She was only a month older than Chu Lian, and she should have been the one to marry. The house of Count Jinggan's He Sanlang, if they had gone in order of seniority. However, when matriarch he had made a request to her close friend, the Empress Dowager, for a girl from the Chu family as a granddaughter-in-law. The fifth miss had been down with a serious illness when an imperial physician had come to look at her. Even the physician wasn't sure if the fifth miss could be saved. Thus, the engagement had been given to the sixth miss, Chu Lian. Right after the engagement had been decided, the fifth miss mysteriously recovered from her illness. He Sanlang was famous in the capital, and there were very few ladies who would refuse an engagement with him. When the fifth miss recovered from her illness, she was jealous, of course. Now, Chu Lian had come back to visit her maiden home, all radiant and dazzling, without any traces of the wretched appearance she had had when she was still living in the Ying estate. She was clearly a beautiful little wife loved dearly by her husband. How could fifth miss hold back her anger? This rich, pampered life should have been hers. Sometimes she even wondered if her sudden illness had been Chu Lian's doing. If poor Chu Lian found out what fifth miss was thinking, she would have definitely rolled her eyes. What the heck? If you want such a weird husband, I'll give him to you for free. Chu Lian didn't take Miss Su's words seriously, even though she really wanted to speak the truth and tell them that the sweets of the Jingan household actually weren't all that tasty. They definitely wouldn't believe her. Chu Lian just smiled. Fifth sister, you're wrong there. No matter how delicious the sweets of the Jingan household are, they'll never taste like the sweets I had in my maiden home. Madame Wrong sensed the jealousy in fifth miss words, so she hurriedly tried to smooth things over. Sixth sister is right. The Ying estate is sixth sister's maiden home. We ladies of House Ying are united in our hearts. Even after marriage, you are still a lady of House Ying, no matter how good it is outside. How could it compare to the home we grew up in? A lady standing by her side made sounds of agreement. That person standing by Madame Wrong was most likely her daughter-in-law. Fifth miss snorted lightly and stopped chasing that line of talk. Thus, the group of ladies settled down for tea. When Chu Lian saw from the corner of her eyes that one of Madame Wrong's senior servants had gone to fetch the tools for brewing tea, her expression changed imperceptibly. She recalled that the novel had mentioned how Chu Lian had shown off her sencha brewing skills to this group of ladies on the day of her visit to her maiden home. Before she could think of a game plan, Madame Wrong happily spoke up. Sixth sister, we've long heard of how sixth sister is the best at brewing sencha in our house. I wonder if we could have the honor of tasting it today. Chu Lian's black eyes darted about. I can only do my best and hope my dear sisters won't laugh at my poor skills then. There was nothing to gain for the unmarried ladies if they competed with Chu Lian. This was a small group consisting of family members, and Chu Lian had already married out of the house. Thus, the ladies were smart enough to give Chu Lian some respect, at least for now. Other than the unhappy fifth miss, Miss Su, everyone took turns asking about Chu Lian's life in the Jingan estate one after the other. However, Xian showed a little worry on her face as she served her mistress from behind. Sixth miss had said that she didn't like to drink sencha anymore. She wondered if it would affect her brewing skills today. Chu Lian kept calm and maintained a gentle, charming expression on her face, without any trace of anxiety. Upon seeing this, Xian slowly calmed down as well, thinking that sixth miss was likely confident in her skills. Somewhere further away, without Chu Lian's knowledge, there was a slightly feminine-looking young man looking at her voraciously. Madame Wrong's senior servant worked fast. Within a few minutes, she had already retrieved the set of tools required for brewing, and she placed them one by one on the stone table. The small pot used to boil water was right next to fifth miss, so Madame Wrong asked Miss Su to pass the small copper pot to Chu Lian. Fifth miss had already been looking for a chance to make trouble for Chu Lian when Chu Lian reached out to receive the pot. Fifth miss let go of the pot without waiting for her to hold it properly. Normally, Chu Lian would have been able to catch it safely. However, she had just been trying to think of a way to avoid showing off her sencha brewing skills, so she went with the flow and pretended not to catch it. The hot surface of the pot brushed across the back of Chu Lian's hand, leaving behind a small patch of red. She cried out in shock and held onto her hand. The copper pot landed on the floor with a loud clang, and the hot water splashed everywhere, causing the gentle ladies to shout. In a short moment, the pavilion was in chaos. Fifth Miss had also seen what had happened. Although she was happy inside because she had caused trouble for Chu Lian, she was also a little afraid that she had gotten herself into trouble too. Due to Chu Lian's injury, she bit her lip, admonishing herself for being too rash. Xian suffered a huge shock and quickly pulled Chu Lian's hand over, pushing up the long sleeves. Upon seeing the red burn, about as large as a peach blossom, on the fair back of her third young madam's hand, Xian's eyes reddened as well in sympathy. Third young madam, does it hurt? Please let this servant put some medicine on it quickly. Although she had used the long sleeves to block the pot, the small burn was still quite serious. However, she could bear with the pain. Chu Lian took her hand back and smiled at Xian, using her eyes to reassure her maidservant. On the other hand, it was Madame Wrong who thought that Miss Su had acted out of line when she saw Chu Lian's burn. She glared at Miss Su and pulled Chu Lian's hand over. Luckily, it's not too serious. Hurry back to your courtyard here and apply some medicine. This place isn't too far from your Angxiang court. When she heard Madame Wrong mention Angxiang court, Chu Lian sighed inwardly. This was what the author had written in the original story after all. No matter how hard she had tried to avoid it, it seemed like there was a strange power pulling her along the original path of the story. Miss Su lowered her head, not daring to explain herself. Chu Lian couldn't help but feel a little helpless. Someone was getting in trouble because of her, but it had been necessary. She had to play long to get out of brewing sencha. Although Miss Su had indeed wanted her to make a fool of herself, Chu Lian had also used Miss Su for her own selfish reasons. Feeling a little guilty inside, she said, "Eldest sister-in-law, please don't get angry at fifth sister. I was careless and dropped the pot. It's not fifth sister's fault." Miss Su glared at her discreetly, the meaning in her eyes clear. "I don't need you to take the blame for me, you goody two-shoes." Chu Lian decided not to continue explaining. Instead, she turned and followed one of Madame Wrong's senior servants to Angxiang Court. Angxiang Court was the courtyard that Chu Lian lived in while she was still at the Ying estate. Although she wasn't favored in the Chu family, she was still a legitimate daughter of the house after all. There were differences between daughters born of the legitimate wife versus those born from concubines. In the Ying estate, legitimate daughters didn't have to squeeze into a single courtyard with the rest of her sisters. However, right after Chu Lian left, Madame Wrong found that the expressions of some of the ladies from the second branch seemed a little off. When Chu Lian was no longer in sight, Madame Wrong's expression turned serious and she coldly asked, "What's wrong now? It's just a simple visit from your married sixth sister. Why can't we have everything go smoothly?" Madame Wrong was the wife of the first son of the main branch. She usually stayed in the east compound and would rarely visit elsewhere in the Ying estate, so she wasn't up to date with the latest news in the west compound. Upon seeing Madame Wrong's expression turn darker and darker, one of the ladies hurriedly stepped out to speak. "Eldest sister-in-law, eighth sister moved into Angxiang Court yesterday." "What?" The eighth Miss Yuan, was the daughter born from the second wife of second master. She was 3 years younger than Chu Lian. The one who had just spoken was the third branch's legitimate daughter. The ninth Miss Fu. Madame Wrong felt a headache coming on. Chu Lian had just married out of the estate, and after only 3 days, on her visit to her maiden home, her courtyard had already been taken up by someone else. If this happened to any other lady, they would be unhappy too. Grandfather was intent on striking up good relations with House Jinggan through sixth sister. However, sixth sister had just come back for a visit and so many troublesome things had already happened. Would she even think of helping the Chu family in the future? You, little Yuan, you're too thoughtless." Miss Yuan refused to admit any wrongdoing and raised her chin as she talked back at Madame Wrong. "She's already married and no longer one of us. Why can't I move into Angxiang Court? I'm also one of father's legitimate daughters. My mother agreed to it too." Madame Wrong's face flushed red in her anger. She tossed her sleeves and chased after Chu Lian. Seeing this situation, fifth Miss started to feel a little pity for Chu Lian instead. However, After remembering that Chu Lian had a handsome and caring husband, Fifth Miss thought that she didn't deserve her pity in the slightest. With Xian supporting her at the side, Chu Lian recalled the events in the novel as she walked. Upon returning to her maiden home, the Chu Lian from the novel had also found out that her courtyard had been taken over. Aggrieved and angry, she had gone alone to the small bamboo forest in the inner court for a walk to clear her mind, leaving her maidservants behind. That was when she had met Hao Bojian. Chu Lian walked slowly as she made her way to Angxiang court. She didn't have the mood to admire the rather impressive scenery by the sides of the path. The depths of her pupils were cool. She was no longer the original brain-dead female lead. Hao Bojian was full of wild ambition. She wouldn't be interested in a man like that even if he were the last one in the world. However, Chu Lian didn't know that she already gained a follower on the path to Angxiang court. He Sanlang had left the outer court with the excuse of going to the restroom, and he had been slowly following behind her, closely watching her every movement.